What's up, everybody? I'm Brian J.
Sheldon positive.
And we are exploring Wrestling's Multiverse.
Hey, Brian, you ever read those old Marvel What If comic books?
No, I haven't, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
Consider this the professional wrestling podcast version of the Marvel What If comic book.
Yes. It's not a straight fantasy wrestling show, but in a way it is. Explain a little bit more about what we're going to do.
We're going to take a look. Some of you fans may know that have ever sat around and had conversations with each other. Hey, what do you think would have happened if insert insane scenario here?
If Hulk Hogan never went to the WWF in 84, if Ric Flair went to the WWF in 88, if the Ultimate Warrior went to the NWA and Sting went to the WWF. Infinite possibilities abound, and we aim to explore all of them. Even as even as crazy as scenarios like a post-Cold War wrestling scene in the mid-'80s only had the communists won out in the end. That's what I'm kind of interested in doing.
I forgot about that idea.
Mr. P, do you want to cue up what we are going to be exploring this week?
Absolutely. This week we are looking at what would have happened had Vince Jr. not purchased the WWF at the time and went national.
Yes. We're going to go in a bunch of different directions, but you may be wondering what makes this whole thing possible. Doc Emmett Brown, to facilitate time travel, had the flux capacitor. Shelly, do you want to tell the people what makes the multiverse travel possible?
If you would have reminded me in the pre-show meeting what it was, I absolutely would have.
You see, there's so much suck in the wrestling world. Sometimes we get sick of talking about it, but there's a thing that we discovered called the sucks capacitor that will harness all of the suckage of the wrestling multiverse so that we can have safe travels. Only it lasts 30 minutes or less. So each one of our trips will be about 30 minutes. If we go over, then we lose control of the sucks capacitor and we're stuck in some weird sucky limbo dimension, which we'll have to explore the following week. And I think that would be a fun little exercise. So are you ready?
Absolutely.
Everybody listening at home, are you ready? Good, kids. I should get like the Nick Jr. Yay! Anyway.
Hey.
So, I unplugged something a little too fast. My wife would say that's a regular occurrence.
That's more than I want to know.
Alright, so let me get the sucks capacitor fired up here because we don't want to get stuck in everyone's over 6'6" and 400 pound Vince McMahon oiled up muscular universe. Alright, so a little bit of backstory. For those of you who don't know, when Vince McMahon Jr., even though he's technically not Jr., bought the WWF from his father, the original plan, had Vince not purchased it, was to be sold to Vince McMahon's partners, who were Gorilla Monsoon, Arnold Skaaland, and Phil Zacco. Phil Zacco was kind of a seedy wrestling promoter that Vince McMahon Sr. was in business with. So those three would have taken it over if it was not for Vince Jr. So that's where we're going to start. Vince McMahon Jr. was responsible for the whole expansion in the 1980s. And I would argue, which is I think was where I want to kind of start the discussion, man. I think someone would have taken it national at some point. even if Vince had not done it.
The WWF or a wrestling company?
Oh, my bad. A wrestling company in general. Because if you look at TV at that point, pay-per-view had not been explored yet in 84 or even 85. I think the first WWF pay-per-view was the Wrestling Classic, which was in 85, I think, after WrestleMania. So I think the first WrestleMania to be carried on pay-per-view is WrestleMania 3 in 87. But cable was changing television and kind of doing to television what Vince was going to do eventually to the wrestling business, putting a lot of local companies out of business in favor of national cable companies. So I really do think, and I think that's where things would have to start, because someone, I think, would have taken a company national. And the 2 or 3 big names that come to mind would have to be those affiliated with national or major cable networks at some point. You had with Jim Crockett Promotions, who was on the Superstation eventually.
Yes, there was the AWA on ESPN.
Okay, yeah, AWA on ESPN. And then was it the UWF on a UHF station?
I'm not sure.
I want to say there was. I want to say they in the mid 80s, sometime maybe 85, 86, got some sort of TV. But to me, go ahead, man.
I was just saying it wouldn't surprise me.
So let's look at who would have the best shot. Let's start there.
Well, I'm going to call, just to make my life easier. We're going to, any reference currently to Jim Crockett Promotions or the NWA will either be called the NWA or WCW.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
That just makes my life easier.
That's fine. Well, you know, I don't normally acquiesce to that, but I know you've had a long night, so I'm not going to mess you too much there.
I would think that since I believe the first wrestling pay-per-view was Starrcade, that would be probably the best bet. Wouldn't you think?
Yeah, because I'm trying to think about my history here. Georgia Championship was on. Excuse me, guys, I'm coming out. Of course, we've been trying to do this show for a month, and then this afternoon, after putting it off yesterday, I called Sheldon. I said, "Dude, I'm getting sick," and he said, "Stop it."
Those were my exact words.
Exactly. So if I cough or something, I'll try to do it off mic, but I apologize if I'm sniffly. We just didn't want to keep putting it off. So to me, I'm looking at, yeah, they had Starrcade, and Georgia Championship Wrestling sold their spot to Vince on the Superstation, their TV spot, and the territory, and then it ended up going back to Crockett anyway. So
I was going to say, didn't that fail miserably?
Yes, it did. Black Monday. I think it was Black Monday. Black Saturday.
One of the two.
Black Saturday. Yeah, Black Monday was a stock market thing, so sorry, guys. But yeah, it ended up going to Crockett anyway. But the other thing, though, is looking at positioning. Because the AWA was on ESPN at one point, and they were also kind of I know they were in Minneapolis, but they were also affiliated with Chicago.
Yeah, that ended up being a part at some point. They actually started getting parts of southern Canada as well.
Right. So that's, if you look at positioning, WWF was always associated, and I know they don't exist at this point except for maybe a territory, but WWF was positioned well because they had the Garden. They were in, Radio City or Television City, one of the major cities for TV production. And it was, we're New York. It seemed like it was, not Hollywood, of course, but a big city, East Coast hip thing. Whereas Jim Crockett, WCW, NWA, was based, let's just call it Atlanta, because it was mid-Atlantic at that point. It hadn't gone to Atlanta yet. But let's just say it was based in Atlanta. It still doesn't have the same snazzy, catch or the same. I don't know. You know what I mean? It doesn't have the same panache to it than a Chicago.
Yeah, it's not as. I don't want to say not as big city, because Atlanta's still a big city. And I don't want to say refined because I don't want hate mail.
South Dakota.
Montana.
Oh, Montana. That's what it was. Montana.
Montana is the state in question.
That's right.
But I know what you're saying. And I can't find a word for it that both makes sense and won't get us sued by a Chamber of Commerce.
No, I think hip is the thing. Hip, trendy.
Yeah,
No, so I think we're on the same wavelength there. Now it's funny because if you look at the NWA at the time, they probably had the best in-ring talent. The AWA, if guys like Hogan and Ventura and Bobby Heenan and Mean Gene, if those guys didn't go to WWF, if they would have stayed in the AWA, which didn't necessarily wouldn't have done that, and we can talk about that. But they may have still had some of the bigger star power in terms of what ended up drawing in the 80s. And then Bill Watts may have had the best episodic I hate using that word, but he may have had the best episodic wrestling television show of the day of that point. So 3 very interesting sides to that conversation. You've got the best in-ring talent in the NWA and a somewhat less than hip home base. You've got Minneapolis, which was a very old-fashioned territory in style and in substance, but they had some bigger guys and some big personalities. But then you had Mid-South UWF, who had some good wrestling, some potential stars, but possibly the best television show, the best quality television show of the 3. So that's kind of a toss-up, man. That's hard to...
I'm about to mess you up.
Okay.
Memphis.
See, Memphis is a tough one because their reach outside of Memphis or the Tennessee area wasn't that big. And Memphis is still kind of a hip city, man.
True.
Even back then. I mean, some people look at it as kind of podunk, compared to New York or LA or Chicago. But it's still a very hip music center and a very cool place to be.
True, but I was thinking as we were going through these, for the most part, most of Vince's biggest draws and attractions came from mostly 3 of those 4 territories.
Right.
They didn't get a whole lot from the NWA at first, but from the AWA they got Hogan, they got Andre, they got Ventura,
Adonis.
Road Warriors.
Yeah, they didn't go into... They were in the NWA, though, at that time.
Right, yeah, that's true.
They didn't go till 1991.
And then in UWF and with Watts, you had Jake was down there.
Oh, JYD.
Duggan was there.
One-man gang.
DiBiase was there.
Yeah, Butch Reed. I mean, and Butch Reed to a less extent, but yeah.
He was still there.
But yeah, think about it. You had if you just look at their top guys, you had their top announced guy. Wow, man, my audio just got really loud all of a sudden. You had the interviewer, Mean Gene. You had the top manager, Bobby Heenan, and the color guy, Jesse Ventura, plus the top probably the two biggest guys out of there, Hogan and Andre. John Studd was a big deal then, and that's all from AWA. And as you mentioned, who was the other half of that first main event at WrestleMania? Roddy Piper. It's funny, if you look at the NWA guys, you only really had Roddy Piper, Rick Steamboat, and Greg Valentine, and that's all I can really remember.
Yeah, that's all I can think of from that time that made big WWF big time in the 80s.
Yeah, and it wasn't until later. But, you threw a monkey wrench into my idea, which is great. This is why we're doing this. I had not even considered Memphis, and it is a potential. I mean, if you're talking about a race to the top, a race to national supremacy.
The Poffos.
Hang on. At a time when we're talking about racing to the national spotlight, how important would Andy Kaufman have been in that?
Absolutely.
And that's something up until you mentioned Memphis that I hadn't even considered. If they had, and I'm not saying they would have, but if they had the vision that Vince had with using celebrities to showcase the talent, they could have used Andy Kaufman the same way that the WWF used Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper.
Absolutely. And other than the fact that Mr. T and Roddy Piper really, truly, or at least on Piper's side, really, truly disliked each other, Lawler and Kaufman had absolutely every single person thinking that whole thing was a shoot. They even tricked each other.
One of those magical things that'll never happen again in the world of wrestling. So we've got a couple different front runners. Another thing I was considering was, let's say the WWF didn't court all of the big stars. Where would guys like Hogan, John Studd, it's just considering where they would have wound up. Because Hogan, at the end of his run, was not on the good terms with Vern Gagne. Vern, according to Hogan, at least, in his book, said that Vern was kind of digging him out of his Japan money. He was making bootleg Hulkamania merchandise when Hogan was in Japan and selling it and pocketing everything. He wanted Hogan to marry one of his daughters, which I think Zbyszko? No, who did? Was it Zbyszko?
I'm trying to remember.
Someone married one of Vern's daughters, but I think it was Zbyszko at some point. But anyway, so Hogan wasn't on good terms, and if I'm thinking about where else Hogan would have wound up, I don't know if he would have worked out in the NWA with all of the in-ring talent and the focus that they were pushing at the time.
Well, and the thought that I had was when you get closer to the early 90s and you don't have the WWF and what they were doing back then with the body guys.
Yeah, well, the type of wrestling they were presenting.
Do you end up with Hogan, Studd, and them? They end up being Big Josh, the Yeti, and the Shook, and Oz.
That's a funny proposition because big guys were still used as attractions in the 80s, and even if you look at one of the biggest acts in the NWA and in the AWA was the Road Warriors, and they were very much body guys.
Right.
So one could say, look at Andre. I just watched the HBO special. Very good for anyone who hasn't checked that out. You should if you can.
We watched it the other night. We loved it.
Okay. Maybe next week we'll do something special, and we'll talk about that after we come back to reality. But next week, next 2 weeks, whenever we decide to do this next. Anyway, so big guys were still an attraction And and Stud and those guys were still big in Minneapolis. But yeah, you're right. With the exception of the Road Warriors, they really didn't use big guys that much in the NWA. There was, I mean, what Ron Garvin, what maybe 5'10",
Yeah.
Rick,
Well,
Ricky
but
Morton maybe 5'9".
yeah, absolutely. But you look at the Road Warriors, and the thing about the Road Warriors was they were big guys that beat the poop out of you.
Yeah,
They're not the guys that I would necessarily think of when I think of body guys.
right. Yeah, no, that's right. They weren't just stand around, pose, lumber around, throw a forearm, you know, bear hug.
Leg drop a guy,
Like what?
leg drop a guy,
Yeah.
even though 47 other people have leg dropped them to no avail.
Yeah, those guys were throwing drop kicks. So those guys were north of 300 pounds and throwing drop kicks at people.
Right.
Hawk, they called him Hawk because he flew around the ring. Animal used to do that. He'd have two guys grab him for almost like a double atomic drop. He'd do the backflip over him, hit the ropes behind him, and then double clothesline. I mean, you're right. They were doing some innovative stuff. So, and if you look at the 3 or 4 companies we mentioned that were the front runners, I know AWA had some strong talent, but looking at just how regressive their production was and their characters and their presentation, I would have to think that the NWA going head to head would blow them out of the water.
Right. Yeah, I know. I would agree.
Gator, Scott Hall, and Greg Gagne, match them up with an Arn Tully or a Magnum and Nikita.
Well, and not only Hall and Gagne, but Hall and Danny Spivey.
Yeah.
What were they? American Starship or something like that?
Yeah, Starship Coyote. Yeah, I think it was American Starship. You're right. But like, that was the thing is the NWA had some cool gimmicks like the Road Warriors. The AWA had the American Starship. Like, what the fuck is that?
Back when Scott Hall kind of looked like Burt Reynolds with an afro.
Yeah, that's a great comparison too. Is you have Magnum TA who looks like Tom Selleck, who's a cool dude wearing blue jeans and riding Harley Davidsons, and then you've got Big Gator Scott Hall, who looks like, he kind of looked like Tom Selleck. He had the hair and the mustache, but that it was like, it's like the NWA had some cool gimmicks, and the AWA was kind of like the nerdy type off-brand. You know what I mean? Like the NWA was Toys R Us, and the AWA is KB Toys. As good as KB Toys was.
Well, and actually, if you think about it, if you take a second and put the WWF back in, the WWF gimmicks are to the NWA gimmicks as the NWA gimmicks were to the AWA gimmicks.
Dude, that's a great way of putting it. That is great. So, let's see. The WWF is NBC. NWA is CBS. And the AWA is like UPN.
It's like My TV 20.
Yeah, My TV 20. Mr. Allen's 29 or 2 for 50. You remember those commercials?
2 for 50.
Dude, if Mr. Allen's is out of business and no one owns the copyright, I'm not going to buy it. I'm just going to make some like fake advertisements to put in our show because I want to be sponsored by Mr. Allen's. 29 or 2 for 50.
The one right here by the house is still open.
Oh, damn. Oh, well. Damn, double damn. Anyway, moving on. The other thing is, where would Savage have wound up? That's another guy that was, to me, he was off the radar when I was thinking about it at first. But I started branching out and thinking, okay, what about a guy like Savage? Because Savage has the work rate of an NWA guy. But he also has kind of the showmanship of someone you would find in the AWA who gets like the big personality aspect. But he also had ties to Mid-South and almost went there before going to the WWF. And I know Lanny had wrestled there for a while. So,
and not to mention that Lanny, Randy, and
Angelo?
Thank you. Owned a promotion in Memphis
Right.
as well.
So that's the other thing. Would they have teamed up? I mean, think about Randy Savage as a top attraction versus Jerry the King Lawler as a top attraction.
That would have been wonderful.
Yeah.
That would have been something really, really fun.
I'm trying to remember
Or even Randy and Dundee.
Yeah. And see, that's the other thing too, is if they didn't push the Giants like New York would have, you could have gotten away with Superstar Dundee as a 5'2" sawed-off killer.
And Austin Idol and all of those guys in Memphis.
And another thing, where would the Hart Boys and the Bulldogs and Bad News Brown or Allen, excuse me, where would those guys have wound up?
Here's a question that you just made me think of.
Okay.
Does Stampede have a foot in this?
Probably not, because I know at some point they weren't doing well, which I think is one of the reasons that Stu sold to Vince.
Because they had the Bulldogs, the Hart, all 97 Hart brothers.
Yeah, Vince bought them out.
And Pillman and Bad News Brown and the Natural, Don Callis.
See, I'm thinking AWA.
Yeah, probably, because they seem to have that. They seem to have that old Canadian wrestler thing in AWA.
Yeah, it just Northern Territory. Because then you start thinking about branding and styles. You know, the NWA, Mid-South, Memphis all have that kind of Southern style. But the Calgary thing kind of fit in with the AWA. Northern, yeah. Which kind of Midwestern if you think about it, too.
Yeah.
So that seems like a fair assumption.
I know it became kind of a bigger deal later on, but does Portland come in?
No, I know they had Buddy Rose, they had Piper at some point, they had Raven, in the early '90s. But other than that, who do they really have? I mean, Piper had even been gone from Portland. He'd been in NWA before he went to the WWF.
True.
So I don't think Portland would have been one of the major players. The major players always seemed to me like the AWA, the NWA, Memphis to an extent, and the WWF. And there's another thing too, is Wood Monsoon and Company tried to venture out, having such a strong base as New York City with Madison Square Garden, because they were always like, and it's positioned this way, but they were always kind of seen as the Mecca in some ways. Like if you went to Madison Square Garden and wrestled, you'd made a ton of money. So would they have tried to make a go of it, or are those guys so old school they would have just kind of let it slip by them?
That's a good point. Well, and the one thing, and I'm fairly certain that you're not going to hear me say this sentence ever again anytime soon. But one of the things that Ole Anderson always said was he said he talked to Vince one time, and they said we sold out Madison Square Garden, and he said, "Well, when are you guys going back there?" He said, "In a month or two." He goes, "Oh, we just sold out Atlanta. We're going back next week, and we'll sell it out again."
Yeah.
And then the next we'll go there and sell it out again.
Excuse me. Yeah, so you have that then. Just letting you know, we have about 3 minutes left before the sucks capacitor explodes and we're stuck in some random shitty dimension next week. But how does Japan figure into that too? Because Andre, Hogan, Those guys all went to Japan. What they just said, forget it. We'll wrestle, in New York. We'll wrestle in Minnesota, and we'll go to Japan. And just done. It's so interesting to think about that because there was a lot of guys from the States making some kind of money over there on a part-time basis.
Well, and a lot of and also actually Calgary had a working relationship with Japan too. So if all the Calgary guys we pretty much have decided are going to Vern, does Vern end up getting working relationship with Japan?
That's a good point. It's a really good point. So if let's wrap this. If you had to make a call between Memphis, AWA, NWA, and now the thing with UWF, they ended up going out of business because the oil industry in like 84, 85 collapsed, which is why Jim Crockett ended up buying the UWF at some point in 86, 87.
Something like that, yeah.
So they may have had no choice but to fold up because they might not have had the support. For that reason, I'd probably still go with the NWA.
I am contrarian.
Yes, we know.
I like my hardcore wrestling. I'm going Memphis.
That's a really good point too. So okay, if you had to go Memphis, on the fly, book me your main event of your WrestleMania Supercard in Memphis.
I am going to say it would be Savage Lawler.
Ooh. If I'm going Jim Crockett, I'm going Ric Flair, Randy Savage.
I like that.
So wow, that's kind of funny. Both of us wound up with Randy Savage in our main event.
Absolutely.
All right, that about does it. Thanks for tuning in. Go to bshowpodcast.com for more. Maybe we can just throw out a couple more, maybe like a mock. I'll make up a mock card with some of my stuff or put a couple things online. Maybe I'll start a section for our mock pay-per-view cards to go along with this stuff. If you want to put one together, that's fine too.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
And I'll put it up. Anybody else, if you have thoughts or if you disagree, if you had some takes that we didn't even think of, which is possible because we did this all in about 30 minutes, send us an email, bshowbrian@gmail.com. You can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/bshowpodcast. I should have a Wrestling Multiverse page up within the next few weeks. Just have not gotten to that yet. You can follow Mr. Positive on Twitter at
That's Positive, no apostrophe.
And you can follow him on Facebook at
Mr. Sheldon Positive.
All right, guys. Thanks for taking the trip with us down the multiverse. Yeah, thanks for hanging out with us this week. I don't know if we'll do another one next week or the following week, but let us know what you think. And we'll see you next time. I'm Brian J. You there, Mr. P?
Yeah, I said my name, Mr. Sheldon Positive.
Oh, sorry, you must have got cut off by the music, so we'll figure this out. We figured out how to travel through dimensions Rick and Morty style, but I can't get the sound mix right. I'm Brian J.
Sheldon Positive.
And this is our Wrestling